Is this on? Can you hear me? Is this yours? Yes. Oh, okay. So Dr. Eric Pearson is going to be leading this panel as he's done for 21 years. But we're waiting for the nameplates. So
that's right.
We're just doing a little bit of housekeeping until the nameplates arrive. And Andy assures me that that will be like within the next 5 minutes or so, maybe less. I think I told you that there is an error on your program badges. One of the movies is not listed. Tomorrow, I think it's tomorrow, Friday, at 10 o'clock. Mm-hmm. Which day is...
Friday, 10 o'clock.
Is Cold War the first movie? Okay, so actually, the first movie is a short film called Sebastian, and it's by Sam Fragoso, who's been attending this festival for a long time. And I didn't want to say it in front of the whole auditorium, but he's been attending since he was in high school, and now he's a grown man and a filmmaker and has one of the most popular podcasts. And he made a short film about his immigrant grandfather from Mexico. And so that's at 10 o'clock. And he will come on and talk about his film. We'll see it. And there won't be a Q&A after the short. And then at 10:30, we'll show Cold War. So I just wanted to let you know about that change. At 10:30 here, we're having another panel called, it's about whether it makes a difference, if it makes a difference, whether women actors are in independent films or Hollywood films. And we'll have a panel talking about that at 10:30. There's another announcement I was supposed to make. Lee or Andy, anything else I'm supposed to announce for today? At 1 o'clock today. 1 o'clock? 1 o'clock today, our screening is Cane River. Is it Cane River?
Faithful Heart.
Oh, thank you.
That's all right.
All right. I did get a little sleep last night. 4 p.m. Rachel getting married. And what is the...
9 p.m. is Bound with Jack Fertilli and Gina Gershon.
Okay. 9 o'clock. All right. Oh, they're here.
We have names.
I give to you Dr. Eric Pearson.
So I want to welcome you all to this panel, which is in coordination with the Alliance for Inclusion and Respect, which is here in Central Illinois, providing lots of services in lots of different venues to the people of this community. The film at 4 o'clock, Rachel Getting Married, is the film that's sort of associated with today's conversation. And I want to sort of give you a little bit of sort of why I'm here and then have the panelists introduce themselves. My name is Eric Pearson. I am a film instructor at the University of San Diego. I also call myself a film educator because I use film as an educational tool, which is one of the reasons why I like participating in this festival, because film is a powerful medium for sharing and changing how people feel about things that are happening in our culture. So that's why I'm here. And the panel, I would like you to sort of introduce yourself. So one of the things we're going to focus on today is sort of the way in which addiction manifests itself in film and television programming. Mostly film. We're talking about film. Because for those of us who may have some experience or limited experience, oftentimes those experiences are filled out by narratives about other people, about other experiences. And so it's a very powerful tool for helping us to understand how those issues are worked out in individuals and in families. So what I'd like to do is have the panelists each sort of introduce themselves and give you an idea of sort of where they stand in this conversation, and then I'll have a few questions, and then about the last 15 to 20 minutes, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions of the panel as well. So we will start at this end of the table. Oh, the microphones are right there, sorry. Yes, I'll do that. I'll do that.
Hi, I'm Marcina Hale. I'm with Reconsider, and we do media and workshops. We've been here a couple times with the film Disturbing the Peace. And my background is as a therapist and have dealt with addiction as well, and in inclusivity. And actually, on a personal level, have dealt with addiction in the family.
Hi, I'm Patty McEachran. Next month, on May 22nd, I will have 6 years of sobriety, and I believe that's a very good thing. Yeah. I relocated to Champaign-Urbana when I came here to the Pavilion and later to the Women's Safe House for the community of recovery that is here and the support and the available meetings. So that's a little bit.
We have a couple other mics too, so you guys can share those. Great.
My name is Chris Gleason. I'm the executive director of Rosecrans Central Illinois. So we provide mental health and substance abuse services here in Champaign, Urbana, and Vermilion counties. I've been in the field of addiction for a long time. I'm a person of long-term recovery. I have 31 years of continuous sobriety. Thank you. Today I do, and I hope for tomorrow as well. And one of my big pushes and why I do the job I do is because of my experience coming into getting treatment, and then also wanting people to experience help and hope, and just decrease the stigma. I love to wear a suit every day, and when people find out I'm in recovery, they are like, wow, we didn't know that was possible. So breaking the stigma.
Good morning. My name's Carol Bradford, and I am a clinical coordinator at Rosecrans, and Chris is one of my bosses. And I work there as a clinical coordinator for all of the outpatient and intensive outpatient substance abuse services for children, adolescents, and adults. Earlier in my career, I worked in child welfare for 22 years and worked with a lot of families where addiction was one of the reasons that their children came into care. I also have personal experience with substance abuse. I'm the daughter of a recovering addict whose drugs of choice were cocaine, alcohol, and marijuana, and my father is a recovering alcoholic as well. So I have sort of a unique perspective because I'm on both sides of it.
Hello, I'm Matt Fagerholm. I'm one of 3 assistant editors at RogerEbert.com, along with Nick Allen, who's in the house, and Nell Minow. And I'm honored to be with such an esteemed group. I mean, I think Roger really believed in the power of film to remove stigmas and those taboos that were unmentionable. And I think film is very much that safe space where we can explore things that's difficult to just talk about outright. And I think Rachel Getting Married is a perfect example of that. It's one of my favorite films, so I'm looking forward to seeing it again today.
Okay. So I'll just start with a question for the folks who have experience in this area. What is it that you think people most misunderstand about addiction? And where can we maybe find some resources that might help us to understand that a little bit better? So what is it that people just don't get sometimes? And any one of you want to jump in, please feel free.
It's not a choice. It's your choice to pick up the first drink or the first drug, and you don't know at the time what your body's how it's gonna react. So after that, I mean, I've had so many people say, well, why don't you just quit drinking? Just quit. And I'm like, well, why don't you just quit eating? It's like, I think that's like the biggest thing. It's not a choice, but it's a choice to stop. It has to be a choice to stop.
I would say I grew up in a very Irish Catholic drinking family. Could make a martini by the time I was 4. And it was common experience in our household. It was what we did. My dad was a career military, and he was a colonel, and I had often picked him up out of the yard and put him to bed, and people never intervened. Their question was, oh, it's just the colonel. He's out drinking again, it's just the colonel. So they excused some of the behavior. And I think that's part of my stance, too, is that this is not a behavior. This is a chronic, recurring disease like any other disease. And I think it's my stance on that is really, for me, is that when people start to see it as a disease and not simply some moral failing or some behavioral problem, they begin to understand the concept. When we get diagnosed, no one shows up at our house with a casserole to support us and put a ribbon around our tree and say, we love you, we support you, and we as a community are going to get you through it. Most often, we do it in secret and in hiding and in places where we don't want to be seen. That's why I work for Rosecrans, because we believe in not hiding who we are. We believe in the power of recovery, and we put our new residential building right next to Hobby Lobby and Menards, right? So I think that's an important piece because we want to be in the community and want to be a part of it.
So anyone else want to? Please, Marcia, go ahead.
A lot of time when you look at it, it's a progressive disease. And so there's often this functional alcoholics. And it's difficult sometimes, even as a child of an alcoholic, to know what is actually happening. So I think that's a big thing to look at.
Yeah. So in putting this together, I was looking at how movies tend to deal with addiction. Films like Leaving Las Vegas, Lost Weekend, Man with the Golden Arm, Flight, Days of Wine and Roses, Requiem for a Dream. And one of the things that seem consistent in this is, this gendered conversation, which is a lot of films about addiction sort of focus on male protagonists, but also sort of male protagonists. The film is about them and their struggle, and it highlights sort of what they're going through. But it's clear that this conversation is much broader than an individual's struggle in these conversations. And if you could speak to one, this idea that it's sort of an individual struggle, and two, second part, sort of deal with this question of gender, because I think that one of the things we're going to see this afternoon is that addiction does not discriminate by gender. And so, but a lot of the narratives would lead us to believe that it does. So if you could speak to sort of this idea of gender, but also that it's sort of this individual, focus on the individual and their addiction and not on other things that might be impactful, please.
So obviously I want this one. I grabbed the mic. So I'll speak professionally and then personally. Professionally, we know that addiction impacts the entire family. And a lot of times what we see is that each individual in the family plays a role in the addiction, whether they do this willingly, subconsciously, in an attempt to help. But one of the things that's really important to know is anything that a family member says and does is either going to help the addict into recovery and through their recovery journey, or it's going to hinder them. It does impact the entire family. My mother was a functional drug addict. She went to work. Sometimes she worked 2 jobs. But she was smoking marijuana every night, drinking, partying, and I was the person in the house witnessing everything and being impacted by it. Were there family members who knew? Yes. Well, that's just the way she is. They minimized it or they were in denial. And so it does. It has a lasting, lifelong effect. At 52 years old, there are still behaviors and ways that I engage with other people that are a direct result of what I witnessed as a child and how I was impacted by the use of my mother. So it is a disease that affects the entire family. And I think as soon as folks can come to that and acknowledge it, and then what role they may be playing in the addiction, because you have people that are the caretakers, they think they're helping, but they may actually be enabling the person to continue their addiction. Usually you'll have somebody in the family that's held up as the hero, the good child, the person that oftentimes the addict is compared to. And then sometimes you have that person who's invisible, they disappear because they don't want to deal with all of the issues surrounding the addiction, or they feel like everyone's focusing on the addict and they're getting left out. So there's so many different roles that family members play. And it can either help or it can hurt.
Well, that resonated with me thinking about the movie we're about to see, and we've been told not to give away too much for those who haven't seen it, but just the general idea of that, the siblings, kind of working off each other. And, Rachel in this movie, Rosemarie DeWitt, she's the one who's getting married, and her sister has been in rehab. She has like a one-day pass basically to go to the wedding, and just all of the friction and the family dynamics. Really, it's fascinating to watch, because the way that Jonathan Demme did this is he did this very much in the style of a Robert Altman film, where, you're not just getting the story of the addict and the sister. It's everyone kind of is there on the periphery, and they're all being observed and acknowledged. There's an incredible scene where they go around a table, and normally in a regular movie, you just, okay, we get a bit of this, a bit of that, and then we get to Anne Hathaway at the end, and she gives this big dramatic monologue. But Demme really allows us to savor every single person. We hear very long snippets, and it's not boring. It's amazing. I mean, you literally feel like you're at the wedding, going around the table, and it's all of that inclusion of everyone else and how they're affecting her and how every member of the family affects each other. It just makes you all the more invested in Anne Hathaway's play, for sure.
Anyone else want to? Can you speak to the gender question? Because you talk this idea that addiction is, at least primarily, in film, it's always sort of about one man's struggle with whatever the addiction happens to be, and how, in some ways, that may be misinformation, but also this idea, because I think you hit on this, Carol, the recovery isn't. It's like how does the whole family go through the recovery process? Right, because that's a different conversation, I think.
Well, I think you said it. The entire family goes through the recovery process. So just like they're impacted by the addiction, they're also going to be impacted by the recovery journey, because things are going to change, hopefully, okay. Right? And so what my mother struggles with now, she's been clean for almost 20 years. But there are several people in our family who still treat her like the addict. And that causes friction and tension and internal, verbal arguing, because my mom doesn't always fit that role that they always pigeonholed her in, because she was the addict. And so as people change and they heal and they get well and they learn healthy coping skills, sometimes the family's still trying to play that same role with that individual that they played during the addiction. And so I don't know how many couples I've seen that one of the persons decides to, that they're ready to take that step, and they start their recovery journey, and the relationship, the marriage doesn't always survive that, because that person changes. And that can be very difficult to handle and accept and deal with. And it's, you know, we as human beings, we tend to hold on to things. And when someone's on a recovery journey, which has its ups and downs anyway, then there's being, like in the movie, Rachel is constantly being bombarded, or not Rachel, Kim is constantly being bombarded by things she did in the past. And so it makes it very difficult for her. And I love the scene, the same scene you were talking about, because what this filmmaker did was, as people were talking, he would cut away to Kim. So you got to, she wasn't saying anything as each person talked, but you could see through her facial expressions, her body language. I mean, when they say the eyes are the windows to the soul, you could see this beautiful person, just every emotion she was experiencing. It's really powerful. And that was a difficult scene for me to watch as the child of someone in recovery. And I kept thinking about different family gatherings that my mother had to sit through. And it was just very powerful. And I do think that because so many films show men as alcoholics, it can be very harmful, because it's not just men, it's women, it's children, it's adolescents. I've worked with adults who started using at age 8. So it's not just adult males. It crosses socioeconomic boundaries. It doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, black, white, short, tall. You can be impacted by addiction, and you can be an addict.
I also want to say that there's times where there's not a recovery, and the recovery can happen within the family, that the addict themselves cannot go through the recovery, but it's still important that the family members individually find a place where they can find their own recovery. And there are a couple different roles in that, because one of them is the scapegoat, and which is a very important position, because they're the ones that are usually the identified patient rather than the addict. And so a lot of attention can be going to that individual, which, if they get help, can help the family immensely. And the clown.
I look at the treatment field as a whole, and for a long time it was focused on male models of treatment, and how do males experience that. And what I've seen is a good dynamic change where we've taken gender into account, where even at our organization, I look at our unit now is that we don't combine men and women together in recovery activities anymore, because they're separate, specific issues that need to be worked on. And most often, I think about my mom, who lived with an alcoholic and a son who is an alcoholic, and her confusion in how does she get help in that process. It was really a dynamic with, my parents gave me an opportunity to leave the house forever. It was not my choice. See, that was a good spin on that story, right? And I remember the leaving part. It was August 26, 1987 at 5:30 p.m. I will never forget that moment, because my mom, who loved me and would rescue me, didn't do it. And that was the transformation for me, is that my family, even in the midst of my dad's drinking, was able to go, you have harmed us too much. And yeah, it was. And I will never forget those moments. I had the opportunity to return the favor to my dad later in life, about 7 years before he passed away. He had fallen in the garage, and Mom was like, what should I do? I said, well, let's call the ambulance. I'm up here, there in New Mexico. He went to the ER. His blood alcohol was 0.3. He said he hadn't been drinking anymore. And I had a conversation with him via phone at the hospital, and I said, I'm going to love you the same way you loved me all those years ago. You can't go home until you address this problem. And my mom gave the same message. So it was a full circle recovery piece. And I think that's what we miss sometimes, is that the hard work is not the moment where someone goes to treatment. That's the easy moment. It is all the moments that come after that, and how the family needs to shift dynamically in order to change. Because I didn't return home for 10 years because our family wasn't ready for me. No.
I believe there still is a stigma about women and the gender because for whatever reason, our country, that's just the way it is. I think it's still the mindset of women, if they're going to drink, they hide it, or they're loose and they'll have sex with you, or there's still the stigma that the man can have his cocktails and he can go out and play golf and blah, but a woman having wine while she's doing housework or whatever, so there's still a stigma. I'm happy to see that there are a lot of women in recovery. I mean, that's very exciting, and I believe that hopefully, and hope I'd like to see more teenagers and that group be addressed too. But the recovery programs aren't limited to anything. This is the most inclusive group of people I've ever met, even at church. Men, women, any race, any age. You don't have to have a home, your profession, and we don't ask those things because we know what you're thinking and what you're going through. Your family doesn't know that, and why. So that's a safe place for men and women to go. So,
I just wanted to add one more thing. I think in film, the stigma around women and addiction has a lot to do with how we assign gender roles. And so women are often, at least in American culture, seen as the caretakers of the family. And so how can you fulfill that role the way you're supposed to in society's mind if you're under the influence? And so I think women feel, the women that I've worked with feel a great sense of guilt and shame because they feel that somehow they've failed as a woman, as a mother, as a wife, as a significant other. We have a specific substance abuse treatment group that is for parents who are in recovery, and it is a parenting group. And so it specifically deals with the addicts' issues around parenting and that caretaking role. And so, because there are some unique issues there that men experience as well as parents, so we don't say it's just for women, but most of the women are the ones that want to be in it. But it is a different experience, I think, because of society's assigning gender roles.
When you've mentioned sort of there's groups of people that you work with. I'm the son of an alcoholic, and I was sort of amazed by my understanding in film was like addiction was like, oh, I'll just stop doing that. Like, I'll check in for a weekend, and by Sunday it's all good. And going through that process where my dad had to separate himself from the family, into the hospital because his body was craving alcohol in a way that he had to be removed from it. Are we doing a better job at understanding the whole sort of removal, the process by which people need to be removed from the environment in order to start the process of getting themselves? Because when you talk about these various places where people go, can you give us, how long does it take before someone's ready to maybe go home or back into, or is it just, because I'm fascinated by you use the term journey. And I always thought of alcohol recovery and drug as a destination. And I think it's fascinating that you define it as a journey, which means that it is every day you are on the trail. And that's something that it will help me a lot because I've never heard it talked about in that way. So can you talk about sort of removing people from the environment, and then how do we move back into what would be sort of a normal, I guess, existence, or is it ever really going to be normal again? You're upside down there.
I'm upside down a lot, yeah. I related to what you said about check-in for a weekend because about, you know you're an alcoholic and you have problems with your life when, I was a functioning alcoholic and got great honors at work, but on the drive home, it's between Effingham and Newton, I would think about, do I have enough wine? Do I have enough vodka to get through tonight, and I have to stop at the convenience store. So, you have problems. So I thought I would call this place in Mount Vernon that I'd heard about and take Friday and Monday off work and just, get a little, get some advice for how to socially drink, Well, after the phone interview, she said, well, just, and I told her I wanted to be there 4 days. And she says, well, if we let you here, you're not leaving, So then I waited a whole nother year until a major thing happened. And when you're asking about time, it took me years to, as you said, it's progressive. It's a progressive disease. It took me years to get there. So, a weekend, even 28 days, I didn't think was enough at the Pavilion, because that's the first exposure I had to AA, to recovery classes, and this is a disease, and what it, and I was, so I checked into a year-long program and at the Women's Safe House here, and then I was allowed to work, and I got a job at Carle Hospital, and your life does change for the better. And I just think for anyone to think a few days, even 28 days for some people is not enough, but it's an everyday thing, because it is a journey. A destination means I'm done, I'm here. Right. A journey is till God calls me home. It's every day. So that was a good thing you picked up on that she said.
One of the things I'd like to say is that addiction, we always talk about like alcohol, addiction then moves in. Prescription drugs has helped alcoholism a lot and hurt addiction tremendously. And so, for a lot of people, they have moved from alcohol into prescription drugs, and so it can be hidden more as well. So I think the journey is definitely never ending. I remember an interview from Billy Joel, who was interviewed, and he said, what is your biggest accomplishment? And he said, my sobriety. And this is a man who has amazing talents, but that was the most important to him, and he knew he had to hold on to that.
I'm going to put my advocate hat on, because I think what we've done for insurance companies have done to the addiction field, they haven't done to other things. They've put terms and limits, and we're struggling with that right now. Even Medicaid, and they 14 days, you should be good. Well, I participated and practiced in my journey of addiction for longer than 14 days. And so we really, I spent a lot of time advocating on we need to, the disease of addiction, whether it be alcohol, prescription pills, whatever it might be, needs to be treated as the same medical course of any other disease, where we don't penalize people for continuing to participate in their medical problems. So treatment used to be 90, 180 days. Now standard is probably about 28, 21 days. We opened a recovery home. The Mental Health Board has helped us open a recovery home where we can extend that stay for people so that they can be there 3-6 months to really engage in the life process again. 28 days just gets you where you need to be at that moment, but it's all those things after that need to take into account. So I think movies don't help on some levels, and they show the use, a little bit of recovery and treatment, and then everything is either fine or not fine. Well, which is not a true statement. Right. That to get in recovery, that should be focused on longer than all the using that preceded that.
Okay. Yeah, Matt.
Because as you're speaking, I totally agree that there is not enough films that just show the day-to-day, the grueling experience of what it's like to be an addict and to be recovering. And I think one film that actually portrayed this quite well was last year, Beautiful Boy, with Steve Carell and Timothée Chalamet, which was a film I resisted at first because I was, sometimes you are primed for just a more traditional arc of, recovery, conflict. But they really kind of put the whole story out of order, where the timeline is murky. We're not sure what's in the present, what's in the past, because you're always confronting those past demons on a daily basis, and there's all these just little triumphs, and then you fall back. It's just one step forward, one step back, and I thought that film really kind of showed how you're kind of stuck in that, and how it's just a constant journey. It's a constant journey to trying to get better, and it basically, you find out that it doesn't end with everything just kind of neatly tied up. We find that he's been sober, and that's great, but that doesn't mean the journey is over.
And I like the term journey. I use this actually Wednesday in a dual diagnosis group, because think about, let's go back. I told you guys I'm 52. So before cell phones and GPS, you had a map. And if you were taking a trip, you would map out your journey, most people. And what you didn't know by looking at that map is if there was a roadblock somewhere along the way or a detour, right? Now we've got technology that tells us, coming up ahead, that exit is closed. But I think of recovery, first of all, as a journey, because on a journey, when you take a trip, we don't always all take the same route to get where we're trying to go. We don't always take the same mode of transportation. But a journey also means that there are straight roads, and there are curves, and there are turns, and there are places where you have to stop, in places where you have to pause. And sometimes on our journey, there are things that come up that we weren't expecting, like roadblocks or detours, or an accident on the road that we have to stop or bypass. So every person's recovery journey is different. And I think that what I try to empower the clients with is, just because your journey doesn't look like the person sitting next to you in group doesn't mean you're less than or that you're not doing something right. The hardest step is taking that first step, but it's also that it's not the last step. And so we actually had this discussion on Wednesday that some people need to go to detox first and get everything out of their system so they can participate fully in treatment in a healthy way. Some people need to go to residential inpatient treatment services where they're getting care and treatment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's true, that's usually 28 or 30 days. But then I work with clients who come out of residential and they go, well, why do I need to be in this intensive outpatient services group for 9 hours a week? I just did residential. And I have to work with them on understanding that that was the beginning of your journey. That was just the start. And sometimes I get, blank looks or mean looks or whatever, but it's a very tough discussion to have with the client, but also with family members.
Carl Jung actually was asked before the starting of AA. Who started that again? I know he's from Ohio, but I don't remember. Anyways, he consulted Carl Jung, and Carl Jung said, you'll never get rid of addiction. Addiction is the absence of a spiritual connection. You have to find something more powerful. And what was more powerful was what kind of life you can have when the addiction's not there. And so the ability to not just remove the addiction, but to be able to create in a way that's more compelling. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges right now, because we have huge amounts of depression with the kind of world and society that we've created for ourselves and one another.
Yeah, and I'm going to open the floor up for questions, but I want to have you deal with this question. Can you talk about, you mentioned this idea of sort of spirituality, because I know that churches and other organizations have been sort of really, in some ways, sort of stepping up to help people and trying to fill some of these voids that maybe aren't filled by organizations. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you might work with organizations that are sort of outside of what we would consider professional groups, but are essential to the person's recovery?
Yeah. Yep.
I also want to say spirituality, he was not referring to religion, but the relationship to life itself, something that inspired them in their life.
Right. And I think the tenets of recovery start with that spiritual principle that you have to have something bigger than yourself to believe in order to see that this journey has some process to get to. 12-step AA is good. Celebrate Recovery. You got Grow. You've got NAMI. You've got all these places where we take peer support who've lived the journey or been a part of that, and I think you meld those together, which gives that spiritual principle. We open it up to our clients related to what do they most need in that spiritual journey, and then we try to match them with that. So we don't have a specific church or a specific person or program. We try to match them with that. My favorite story is with a client that I was working with early on, and I'm like, you have to get on this spiritual journey. He goes, I am. I have a rock on my refrigerator, on the top of my refrigerator, and I turn it over every day, and that reminds me, every day I got to make a turn. I can't keep doing the same thing. And I said, wow. I go, what happens if you lose that rock? I was an early counselor, so I think he sat back and said, I'm going to take him and see what happens here. Because he said, Chris, do you know how many rocks there are in this world? But how pivotal that is that for him is that spirituality is just that no matter if I lose this rock, there's another piece. And I think that's, if we look at spirituality from that context of there's different groups of people that can provide thing. Not one program can provide everything that somebody needs. And I think that's the important part of that. I don't know if that answers that. But.
Yeah. I agree with Chris that the spiritual AA is a spiritual program written by, founded by Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson. And they said that we must have a spiritual transformation. And whether that is God as you know him or whatever it is. When I was in the pavilion, there was a lawyer from Chicago as one of the residents there, and he was very much an atheist and had a real hard thing with these steps. And he goes, well, what if I want, my higher power to be a pink bunny on the moon? And the counselor said, fine, just latch onto it. And, then we had someone say, well, if I pick that doorknob, somebody can come along with the screwdriver and take it off. If I pick that oak tree, you can come over and cut it down. That's right. It could just be nature in general. Obviously my higher power is God. And I've learned through, all the recovery classes and the church I attend, the AA, that, I didn't know what was going to happen when I took that first drink. And I was a late drinker. I didn't drink till I was 20, so it took me a while to catch up. But the reason that whatever it is in my mind and any addict's mind that it's something inside of us, and we're using these things, we're treating a spiritual malady with a physical remedy, and that is why we just keep, So if I truly believe, it's still a struggle, even when you have a great day, everything's going fine, and, spring's coming, and I hear Jimmy Buffett, and I want to go out I want to sit on these outdoor cafes and have a margarita, but I can't. I'll die. So, but I that's a momentary feeling, and it still happens. But I know in my mind, I replay the last time I drank that got me sober, and I never want to go back to that. And I thank, my higher power, my support groups and everything. If we need to work on ourselves in the inside, and we'll fill up those holes. And, if you have a family member, a good friend in recovery or hasn't taken that step, I think that, there are programs for you too, Al-Anon and other things to go to that would really, really benefit because enabling or just detaching, it depends on, there's a time and a place, and that would be up to you. But anyway, I guess that's all.
So, if you have a question, I don't see the mic, which means that it's probably not there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this mic and I'm going to put it on this chair. And so if you have a question, if you just line up here and pick up the mic, and then you can ask your question.
Hi, I'm Dave Zarkin from Bloomington, Minnesota. We haven't really talked much about media, movies and television, except for a reference to Bad Boy, or Beautiful Boy, I mean, and wasn't bad. But what I'm wondering is whether people who are chemically dependent, characters in movies and television shows, need to be worked into the plot as so what? Like we have LGBTQ, we have autistic people in Atypical and Good Doctor, and they are part of what is called normalcy or abnormalcy. And so, do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, no, I see. Go ahead. You want to take that question? I'll take this.
One of my favorite TV programs is Mom. Have you seen that? It's the writers have to be in recovery. I mean, it's because it is just true to life. The situations they go through. It's a comedy drama because they've had some people die, in their show. But the things that they, it centers around a group of women alcoholics. And they're going to their meetings, the sponsors call it, so that's a very, very good, present day, But I noticed too that there's some things you have to do whatever it takes, not to get through the day. So when I get home from work, sometimes I watch a lot of TV, I live alone. But there are a lot of programs that are working alcoholism into the show. NCIS had one of their agents from England come, and they showed him going to meetings. Law and Order, the main lady, Marcia, she has a problem with alcohol, and sometimes she masters it, sometimes she doesn't. And I don't know. There's just more programs I'm noticing.
They're out there, and one of the things I'm going to have my panel do when we wrap this up is to give what they think is a good sort of example of what addiction is like, and maybe an example that's not so good, so that we don't get bad information as well. But that's the last question that we're going to get to. Chaz, you have the mic.
I just wanted to say I didn't know that this was going to be like an AA meeting this morning. Mom is a hilarious program and deals very realistically with someone in recovery, and women. Allison Janney and Anna Faris are the main characters there. Last year, there was a movie, besides Beautiful Boy, Ben is Back, where Julia Roberts played the mother of an alcoholic teenage son who was released so that he could celebrate Christmas with his family. I forgot why they released him. You usually don't just get released because it's Christmas, and it showed a whole day of harrowing things that she was going with, trying to keep him sober while he was out, and with him struggling while he was out. And I thought it was some of the situations you would think were a little over the top, but I've had experience with addiction, both personally and in the family, and some of the things they did were really not over the top. I've seen things even worse. The other movie that I loved last year was actually A Star is Born. Not for the way, it was very controversial the way it dealt with alcoholism, because some people thought it romanticized it, or the big controversy within the recovery community is that at the end, I mean, you've seen A Star is Born. So he commits suicide. I just didn't want to give it away if you didn't know. Some people in recovery thought that was a terrible thing to show someone committing suicide after they've been at a treatment program, but it does happen. I wanted to say, you know, I was always so admiring of Roger, how he dealt with the issue that he was an alcoholic, and it was only later, I was always taught on March 17th this year, I had 32 years of recovery. So, thank you. And it is a journey, and it is a day at a time, and you don't take anything for granted. And today I say, you know, I enjoy life immensely. I just say, today I choose not to pick up a drink. So, the thing about recovery, you know, you said something that really, that you're putting recovery centers in between a Hobby Lobby and a Walmart. And usually they were hidden away, one, because of stigma, but also because I thought they didn't want to put temptations in the path of the recovering addict or alcoholic. The other thing is I thought that they wanted to put them in places where there was more greenery so that the alcoholic could get in touch with nature again. So I was just wondering about your location of putting places of recovery.
Yeah. So, and we have a wide variety. We have some with a lot of green space and beautiful gardens, and we have a recovery home in Lakeview in Chicago that has rooftop that you can see Wrigley Field from, and there's bars all around it, and very controversial. Our space here in Champaign is intentional. It was built for us. Someone else had used it for something else, but I really felt like it was built for us. It allows people to then experience public transportation, getting a job, getting integrated. It's allowed me to have conversations with all the places around us about recovery and how they can support. And I can't tell you how many stories standing in the checkout line at GFS or at Freddy's, because where else you got to eat there, about thank you for those things. So it's very intentional, because I think for myself as a person in recovery, I never hesitate to tell people. And people are like, you talk too much about it. I said, because it's me. That's who that's that part. We want to impart that on people. If we're going to break the stigma, we have to be seen. And we have to be heard. Sir?
I have just a brief observation and a question about film. Most recently, we're aware of addiction through the so-called opioid crisis. And it was striking to me to see how quickly that's discussed as a medical problem, which is highly unusual in this culture, because many times addicts are presented as criminal problem. And so we have a long history of a clash in the public perception and the narrative about addiction between criminalizing and medicalizing. And my question is, are there any, I thought so. The other thing I want to notice is that this is racialized. And so my question, you name many films in which addiction is portrayed either well or not so well. Is there any attempt in film or media to present African American people, non-white people, as not criminals when they're dealing with addiction?
I wish I had an answer for you, because there's been one of the weird ironies of sort of the opioid addiction conversation is that I'm old enough to remember the crack cocaine epidemic and how it was so racialized and people couldn't get treatment because they were criminals. They weren't people who had a disease. And there's a part of me that doesn't. There's not a lot of value in relitigating the history, because we got to figure out where we are right now, and there are people who need help right now. But it is, I think it's important, and maybe this is an opportunity for us to have a bigger conversation, a more encompassing conversation about how we might be racializing what is a universal disease that's affecting a lot of people, and the media's responsibility, people like Matt and myself who work in sort of the critical part of this to be able to celebrate those films that and television shows that do that, and also perhaps call attention to those films that need to do a little bit more homework before they pick up a camera. So I'm gonna take one last question here, and then I'm gonna have the panelists address my last question, and then we'll be done here.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. You've made so many points of what was bothering me. I had a son who was dual diagnosed, mental illness and addiction. And there is a significant portion of addicts who have mental illness, who are untreated or diagnosed very late. And it was at a time when counseling was blaming the parents. Whatever was wrong with my son was our fault. And it did terrible harm to the family. It was not constructive at all. We could have used some information on that. It was a time before special ed. So the teachers, the education, there was just no support whatsoever. And I hear a little bit from some teachers today where it's not a lot better. It took me so many phone calls over the country and reading to find, I had heard somewhere that there was dual diagnosis psychiatrists. But it took me years to find somebody until a newspaper article mentioned one psychiatrist in the Chicago area who was dual diagnosed trained. So we got some help, but it was very erratic, very terrible. My son died of a heroin overdose eventually. And the reason being, I think, that we tried as much as we could to go all over to get help for him. It just was not there for dual diagnosed. Mental illness and addiction go together. And we were told first, you have to treat the mental illness before we could treat the addiction, or you have to treat addiction before you treat the mental illness. There was no time, many years, where there was not dual diagnosed people. So we were at a complete loss. And my son had so much to give. He is so sorely missed. He was a beautiful person without the support of anybody. You know, I'm just so sorry about that. It was such a loss to everybody. I wonder if that is being addressed now. Is there a recognition? Somebody mentioned dual diagnosed, but it was a terrible problem for us. Is it better today? Is the family getting a support so it's not their fault? Is it recognized? What are they doing in the schools? What about the stigma? He had a terrible time socializing because he had both illnesses, because he had an ego problem. I mean, there was ramifications, as you say, of the whole family, of things that we didn't know what to do until it ended with his death just a few years ago, as still a young person.
I say we're in the process of getting better. One of the things that we need to do as a field for both mental health and substance abuse is that we have to create what I'm trying to create is a no wrong door process. That no matter what door you walk in, you get the services that you need. So it doesn't matter if you have a mental illness or substance abuse, you get treatment based on what your need is at the same time, in the same place. And utilizing good practice, good medical evidence practice. We have a long way to go in schools as well. I have a daughter, and she'd be okay if I shared this. She's getting her MSW in a couple weeks, but who's bipolar and has struggled her entire life. And I remember the day the school social worker called me and said, we can no longer help your daughter. I'm like, what do you mean? So I went down there, and part of that was because she's a very high-achieving student, but they didn't know what to do with her. And so I spent a lot of time trying to advocate for that. So I think we're doing better in schools. We could do a lot better. We need to do more and balance out mental illness and substance abuse and all that, and give it the same attention we're giving academics. And that would be my feedback.
One of the things that I love about working for Rosecrans is because one of the requirements of our addiction counselors is that they have to, when they're doing an assessment, on a client, a potential client, or they're doing the intake where they're setting up the treatment plan, they have to ask about family involvement and support systems. And whether the family is related by blood or a long-term friend of the family, but one of the questions is, who do you have in your support system? And if they don't have anyone, part of the treatment is building that support system for them, because they're going to need that support on their journey. And it's really important. We know, just based on some research studies, that people who have family support in recovery have much better outcomes. But sometimes, like Chris said, there's work to do, because sometimes people with mental health issues and addictions have burned bridges. They have to make amends. They have to heal some broken relationships. But the goal is always to bring in family, friends. It may even be the boss on their job. For a young person, it may be the football coach. So family is very broadly defined. And besides Al-Anon, we try to make sure that we get folks to sign releases so that we can include their family members in their treatment. They don't always want to do that at first, but we're always checking back in, 3 months in, 6 months later, because things do change as they get healthier. I love our dual diagnosis program. I'm helping out with the group right now because I need to hire a dual diagnosis clinician. Someone throw that plug out there. But I love it because then I don't get rusty. My skills don't get rusty, so I get to practice it. But I just enjoy listening to the folks in the group and make that realization that those two are connected. We had a question in Wednesday's group, which comes first and does it matter? And that was such an amazing discussion to sit back and hear them sharing and talking about that. So I do think we need to, as a society, move closer to seeing them as connected. It's not two separate things. I remember early in my career being taught the same thing that you mentioned about, well, you can't treat the mental illness unless they're stable, not using, and you can't deal with the substance abuse treatment if they're not stable mentally. Were there some underlying, pieces of truth to that? I think that did more damage and kept people from getting the help that they needed.
There's a speech from Lana Wachowski that she gave for human rights, and one of the things when she went through her change from being from a male into female in transition, she gave this speech, and she talked about the problem being not with her changing, but the society that creates the stigma that makes that difficult for her to deal with. And I think that in general, what we're looking at is suicide has now, if you don't know, become one of the leading causes of death in the United States across the board. Leading cause of death of our college students for a while and our military. We are not looking at what society we've created that makes mental illness so prevalent in our society. And being able to look at our young people saying, it's not that they want to fit in, is they want to be accepted. Can we create an environment in our addictions facilities as well that lets them feel accepted for who they are and what they're dealing with?
Yeah. So we are almost out of time, but I did promise I did ask this question because this is about sort of using the arts as to have a conversation with Stigma. So I asked our panelists to give us sort of one film or piece of media that they thought would be really helpful in helping us understand addiction, and one that we might want to look at cautiously in that conversation.
All right, I got him. One of the best films I've ever seen about addiction. It was by a former Ebertfest guest, James Ponsoldt, who did Spectacular Now and the end of the tour. It's a film called Smashed, and it's about a couple who is the very foundation of their of their romance is built on their alcoholism, and it starts to rupture when the woman, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, wants to get sober. And it's a really fantastic movie. A film that did not get addiction right, Reefer Madness.
Okay. Do you have one for us?
I guess I'm going to answer this. There's some movies that I can't watch. It's triggering for me as someone who lived it and grew up in the midst of it. But a particular film that I like, and I don't know if it gets it right or not, but I can watch it and I can relate to it, which is 28 Days with Sandra Bullock. I really love Rachel getting married. And even though it only shows a snapshot, I think it gets it right. And that's really important. I think that in film, we have to realize that no matter what, it's for entertainment. And so there are going to be things that are put in there to keep your attention and to make it entertaining. And so I think for me, it's been really helpful to watch documentaries. Even some of the documentaries on celebrities that I've watched recently, there's some really good ones. I hate to say Netflix, but Netflix and Amazon Prime. There's a James Brown documentary. There is a Sam Cooke documentary. There's a wonderful documentary on Quincy Jones called Quincy, but it spans his entire career, and there are several people in that obviously in the entertainment business, drug and alcohol addiction is an issue. But there's a lot of wonderful documentaries about ordinary people struggling with addiction and how they overcame it and how they became advocates. So I guess for me, the films really most of the time don't get it right. Okay. Because they do things in it for entertainment that takes away from the reality, and I kind of struggle with that.
Okay. Christian,
Mine will be really quick because I don't watch a lot of movies or TV, sorry. For the very reason of triggering events. But I think the important part is that to recognize that the sensationalizing of the using is always, for me, has always been the prime part that I just can't handle. And we only spend 5 minutes on the recovery part. And I think it's important. And I think also outside of film, I think shows like Intervention, those kind of shows also do good and bad in that process because they don't show the whole process. They show the sensationalized, they show that, and then here's the story at the end. They might or might not have gotten recovery, and those were a year-long process. So I think we have to be very careful how we engage in those and see the value.
I would have chosen 28 Days, but that was before Beautiful Boy came out. And I think that was honest about how the father just, he wanted to help him. He wanted to save him. And finally, he pulled back. And it was based on a true story. So I like those. You know, the first movie I can remember ever seeing was Days of Wine and Roses that had alcoholics in it. So I don't really have a bad one you know. I think the films that make people aware are very good, yeah.
I will have to say that to get a film out nowadays is difficult. And there is a film that actually we have on Reconsider's webpage. It's called Whispering Spirits. That was done by a father who lost his son. His son was an amazing musician, and his music is being used in there. And the film is for free. The father's giving it for free. The son came out of recovery and died in a one-time overdose, which is common. And he goes around. So this film is available to anybody that is dealing with addiction or that is working with people. And it's a very, very real film about what it's like to lose somebody to addiction and the signs and so forth. So I'd have to say that. And how media gets it wrong in general, I think, is exactly what you were talking about, is associating it with criminalization. That needs to stop. This is not about being a criminal. This is about a very serious social issue that we're having, and it's very personal and collective as well.
Well, I want to thank our panel for sharing with us today. And I hope that over the last hour or so, we've given you some information and some things to think about, and makes dealing with people who are struggling with addiction gives us a little bit of a window into what that struggle is like, even though we may not personally experience it. So thank you very much. We have about a 20-minute break before the next panel, so if you need to get some coffee or use the restroom, please avail yourself of that. The next panel, which is going to be talking about women in film. So, yes?